Great. Daniel Ramot, CEO of VIA. How are you?
I'm good. How are you, Adam? Great to see you.
It's good to see you again. Always a pleasure to talk with you. So for those in the audience that might not be as familiar with VIA, can you just begin by telling folks what the mission is, what's the vision, and how does VIA differentiate in terms of providing mobility solutions for people and for communities?
Absolutely. Thanks, Adam. VIA is a company that was founded in 2012. Our vision is to use technology in particular to create a digital infrastructure, if you will, for public mobility. And we've developed technology starting with on-demand public transportation, with allowing buses or smaller minivans, vans to be routed dynamically based on demand and shared by multiple passengers. And have expanded that technology now into school buses, into paratransit, and basically every vertical across public mobility that we believe could benefit from having better technology.
So why do cities turn to VIA? What is it that differentiates you from, say, other tech platforms like Google or Waymo, Sidewalk Labs? Why do they turn to you?
I think we have a very particular focus on partnering with cities, with public transit agencies, with public transit operators, and supporting them in their, if you will, transformation into more digital entities. We have both the technology that can do that, which is proprietary. It involves some fairly sophisticated routing and matching of passengers with vehicles in real time, fleet management, customer support, everything that's required to provide a real world successful public mobility service. But we also have the operational expertise. We are operators ourselves. We run quite large services across several cities, in particular New York and Washington, D.C., and a number of other cities around the world. And I believe that ability to combine the technology, be kind of a tech company, but also with being a real operations company, speaking the language of the operators, of the bus drivers, of the operations managers, I think it makes a huge difference, understanding what they're really facing and being able to provide whether we're just providing cities with our software or providing them with a turnkey transportation solution, transportation as a service is how we think about it. We're bringing that operational expertise to bear that I think makes a big difference.
From our earlier discussions, the problem of increasing efficiency of transportation at a city level is pretty complex. It involves data, physical infrastructure, hygiene and cleanliness, safety, regulatory authorities, human resources, a specialized skill. But one of the things that's been adding to that, at least in our discussions with capital markets participants, is on sustainability and decarbonization. Can you reflect on kind of how VIA is helping cities reduce the carbon footprint, and what is VIA's broader view on EV adoption?
Yeah, and first, I think you're absolutely right. I think that kind of supporting cities in modernized public transportation, whether it's data or simply sometimes change management, sometimes the hardest piece is getting the operators, whether the drivers or the operations managers, to adopt the technology, creates a much larger challenge than may seem from the outside. I would say on the sustainability front, the way we see our ability to contribute is, one, making the transportation networks themselves more efficient. So sometimes, people think of a bus as a highly efficient way to move people around, but if that bus is nearly empty and only moving one person because it's running at 2 a.m., that's not a particularly sustainable way to run your system. So how do you think about that scheduling? How do you run the right sized vehicle at the right time? Maybe replace, when there's low demand, several fixed routes with a more dynamic van or shuttle solution. Those are some ways in which I believe we can help transit agencies and cities run their existing networks more efficiently. And the other piece is, as you make that network better, as you're adding more data-driven, dynamic components to it, you're attracting more and more passengers into the network at the expense of other modes that are less sustainable, private cars in particular. And so I think that piece is very important. It's both growing the public transit network to new users and making it inherently more efficient. And of course, as we move towards electrification, you can get locally far lower emissions by using electric vehicles. And thinking about how to use electric vehicles efficiently, how do you think about that electric fleet as, if you will, a distributed battery across which you can optimize energy use rather than individual batteries, and schedule the vehicles, schedule their charging breaks and so forth accordingly. That's something that over the last year or two we've been integrating into our algorithms to make that system even more efficient and green.
So Daniel, can you remind us how many cities you're operating in, not just in the actual vans themselves, but just what you would call client cities, if you will?
Yeah, clients, or so we like to refer to them as partner cities. We have nearly 100 cities. We have agreements with about 120 cities around the world in over 20 countries. And we already operate either through deploying our software or running vans directly, mostly on behalf of partner cities. For the most part, I'd say 95% of our deployments are through partnerships with cities and transit agencies. And we have additional cities that are launching, some of them a little delayed due to COVID, but generally have about 120 of these partners.
Sure, we'll get to COVID in a second, but you're obviously in a position to see what works and what doesn't, and which cities are more accommodating, I should say, to future mobility solutions, electrification, autonomy, et cetera, and then those that might not be. From the ones that are at the leading edge, and I think in our discussions, there are many in Europe, although not limited to Europe, I'm sure in Israel as well. What are some of the lessons and benchmarks that you're seeing, particularly on sustainability, that could be applied to other cities that need to get the message?
I think the key is to me is to use sort of the right solution for any given problem. So there are, I don't think that on-demand transit or sort of digital transportation is a magic bullet. It's going to, running a van down Fifth Avenue as your main mode of transportation is probably not the right way to solve the problem. I think a large bus, sometimes sort of an accordion bus, is going to be much more efficient in moving a much larger number of people down Fifth Avenue. However, even running down Fifth Avenue at 4 a.m. in the morning on a Sunday may not be that useful to run a bus. There may only be 1 or 2 passengers. So that's where running a van, and maybe a van that's dynamic, that only stops where it needs to stop and not at every stop, could be much more efficient. So I think the key is to sort of match the solution to the problem. There are places where running on-demand transportation is going to be extremely useful and sort of utilizing a lot of data, and places where just running a bus every 3 minutes is going to be the best way to approach. And I think the agencies and the cities that we've seen that have been most successful are ones where there's a true partnership, where we work together to understand, the needs of the city and what they're trying to solve using public transportation, and then tailor the solution appropriately. And from our side, that means that we have to be very flexible, and the product has to be very modular. And I think where we're starting to see real benefits is where cities, and this is just starting to happen, where cities are integrating modes that historically were very distinct, like paratransit, school transportation, sort of standard public transportation, bringing all that together and utilizing the assets, in a sort of smart way across modes. That's where we're starting to see some real benefits that I think lead to sustainability.
Okay, I want to move to autonomous. And it seems like, at least from my lens at least, that the hype around autonomy might have peaked, at least a mini peak, a couple of years ago. There's been a bit of a shakeout. The availability of capital has been a little bit more constrained. Still a lot of very high hopes long term, but maybe a bit more of a realistic cadence of adoption. Just my question to you: do you think that AVs are still overhyped? Maybe not in terms of destination, but in terms of that time to market. Do you think they're overhyped?
Yeah, I certainly think AVs were overhyped, maybe up until a few months ago or a year or so ago. I think, as you and I have discussed, I think now it feels like there's a lot more realism about where AVs are. And I still sometimes see announcements by large companies saying we're going to have fully autonomous fleets next year or 2022, which feels unrealistic. But for the most part, I think there's a sense of a bit more reality that has settled in. I do think that long-term AVs have a lot of potential, particularly if cities are willing to invest in the infrastructure to support them. So I believe that rather than trying to solve the full complex problem of an AV driving around New York City with no constraints, surrounded by human drivers. I think if we're trying to solve a much simpler problem of AVs in dedicated lanes, in dedicated regions, that could be something that can happen in a reasonable time frame.
And from your seat, Daniel, what are the gating factors you think? And maybe you could distinguish gating factors between technology and regulatory curation.
Yeah, I think obviously there's some technology gating factors which we'll put aside. I think from a more sort of municipal or sort of government perspective and regulatory perspective, I think again carving out a particular use case where AVs can be successful and creating the infrastructure to do that, and then building regulations around that makes everybody comfortable, I think could be very effective. We build infrastructure for light rail, for subways. We invest huge amounts of money in roads. It could make sense to make an investment in enabling an autonomous vehicle to be successful in certain environments. And so I think it's really, again, identifying that use case, the right solution for the right problem, where an AV can be successful, and then making that investment. And I believe that particularly if AVs are used in a shared context where the vehicles are part of the public transportation system, they're not owned by individuals, they can be extremely effective in certain scenarios.
And am I wrong in thinking that VIA's network of vans or other infrastructure out in the market can be useful in helping to collect real-world mile data and corner cases, and to kind of help train the neural net or machine learning algorithm, not unlike the way Elon Musk likes to boast that Tesla does, and in fact Tesla is doing? I'm just curious if that's a stretch in thinking in terms of a longer term way that your data and platform could be put to use.
No, I think that's right, and I think deploying autonomous vehicles on networks such as VIA's network and some of the data that we're collecting could be extremely valuable for the autonomous vehicle learning and development. I also think we've been watching the autonomous vehicle space at VIA for quite a while, and watching how autonomous vehicle companies are progressing. And I would say a few years ago we'd have conversations and they'd say, we're developing autonomous vehicles. That is the hardest possible problem to solve, maybe in the world. I think some of them felt certainly in transportation, and everything else is going to be very, very simple. We'll just, once we've got that autonomous driving, we're going to have robo-taxi fleets up and running in no time, and this is going to be super simple. And I think today if you listen to some of what those folks are saying, there's a realization that the technology required to run a network of interconnected shared vehicles is, I don't want to say maybe just as complex, but potentially just as complex and difficult, not to mention all the things you said at the beginning of our conversation, Adam, which is the reality of dealing with human customers, working in the context of a regulatory environment, of a city environment, everything that has to do with the politics, the demographics, the challenges of providing transportation. I think people are recognizing that the network problem, running a network efficiently, particularly as autonomous vehicles it's clear they're going to be quite expensive. That problem is potentially just as hard. And certainly, regardless of whether the technology is harder or easier, those are kind of silly arguments to have, is just as important. And so I think where we fit in, the way we see it, is that we've got just a tremendous amount of experience running these networks, and actually have, as I mentioned, 100 and very soon over 100 networks that are active and at quite some scale, and deploying autonomous vehicles into that, I think, is going to be a real opportunity.
Great. And just kind of home stretch here, a bit more topical with the pandemic, COVID-19. What are some of your thoughts in terms of how the health crisis might be changing your business? Does it change how cities think about public transport, and in any way, the utilization or the economics of the model?
Yeah, I think the COVID crisis, I think, creates a real challenge, and potentially also a real opportunity when it comes to public transportation in general, and I think for VIA in particular. I think on the one hand, you see certainly people are staying home with shelter-at-home orders, and that's had an impact on transportation very broadly, whether it's ride-hailing, ride-sharing. We've seen it in our ride-sharing business, for example, in New York. A little bit less of an impact on our business where we're providing software to support transit systems. They've had to many times adapt their systems for this COVID period, but our ability to be very flexible and adapt with them has helped them transform services into services that transport essential workers like health workers. So, a few dozen services of ours around the world are now focused on moving health workers, in some cases even transporting food and other essential essential items to people who are in need and can't leave their homes to go pick up those meals or diapers or whatever it may be. So we've seen sort of a short-term, if you will, evolution of what our services are doing to help cities. And it does feel that cities that have access to a flexible dynamic service are able to get through this crisis better than cities that have just the fixed route network, and it's very, very difficult for them to adapt. Really, their only option is to go to, say, a Saturday service because they have less demand, but that is still highly inefficient, doesn't match the real conditions during COVID. I'd say longer term, public transport is facing on the one side the challenge that people may not want to take public transportation. They may be much more wary of boarding a vehicle that has other passengers on it. They may want to drive themselves. So there's definitely some headwinds around getting people back onto public transport. I think what's going to be important there is to focus on safety and ensure folks that you're managing capacity on those vehicles in the right way. They're being cleaned, the drivers being screened, there's separation between passengers and the driver, maybe even between passengers. Those are the challenges. On the other side, I think what's happening from our perspective is that previously we'd go talk to a transit agency or a city and say, look, you can modernize your system with this technology and achieve all these benefits. And here are examples from 99 other cities that you can look at and some data that's really showing it. And I think there's increasingly a willingness and an interest in doing that. But the impetus to do it right now was always, that was a challenge. Yes, I'd like to do it, but might take a few months, might take a year. The timing was always the question. I think today people are looking at their transit networks and saying the transit network isn't working at all anymore due to COVID. Demand patterns have completely changed. We've got to get people back on transit. And so there's this moment in time where everybody is saying, I need to change my network anyways. And if I need to change my network, well, does that just mean changing the routing and the scheduling of the fixed route buses? Or is it something different? Do I want to introduce technology into this system? And oftentimes the answer is yes. We see a real opportunity to help cities digitize their networks perhaps much faster than was possible before. And cities are open to saying, okay, if I need to change my network anyway, let's take a look at new solutions. Let's take a look at innovative ideas and a technology and do this in a much more efficient manner. And I believe that that's actually required, that for cities to emerge from this crisis and for transit agencies and transport systems to emerge from this crisis in a positive way, they have to leverage technology intelligently, or they're going to be stuck with solutions that are no longer working and face even greater budget crises and declining ridership than maybe previously they had.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And there is clearly a nuance there of how it is a challenge, but also can create new opportunities and urgency. Daniel, maybe just to wrap up, many of us that have been in shelter in place or some form of quarantine all around the world have an even stronger appreciation of essential services, things that are delivered to your door, whether they're goods or food or medical supplies, equipment, you name people. Is there an opportunity at the city level, or even outside of cities at a broader community level, for the VIA platform to be integrated with some of the logistics and or delivery, like transporting things, not just people? Or maybe forgive my ignorance if you're already doing that, but just kind of wanted your thoughts on that.
No, I think that's exactly right. Prior to the crisis, we were not engaged in logistics or transporting packages or goods at all. And what we saw was just purely through demand from cities and NGOs that are now doing things maybe they weren't doing before. Cities were never involved previously in delivering meals, or very rarely, so maybe not never, to their citizens. And now you have situations where kids who were previously, sometimes depending on the size of the city, hundreds of thousands of kids who were going to schools and getting their breakfast and lunch at schools are now no longer going to school, and they don't have access to those critical meals. And so we very quickly found a demand to, by our partners, by our municipal partners, and sometimes through the transit agencies with NGOs who are doing this to support meals, other critical goods being transported during this crisis. So we quickly adapted our technology to do that. We had never done that before. And now that we're in this business, it absolutely seems like an opportunity to plug in our technology into networks of logistics and package deliveries. And so, that may be something that comes out of this crisis that is a new opportunity from our perspective.
Well, Daniel, I really appreciate you updating us on your latest thoughts and the mission of VIA, how it's adapting to this new reality. I wish you and your family success and safety in the VIA community, continued opportunities, and I look forward to engaging with you another time. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Adam. It's always a great pleasure to talk to you. I hope we get to do this again soon, and hope you and everybody else with your family are safe and healthy. Talk to you soon.